Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're finally taking a look at a watch that has been a long time coming. For many, this watch needs no introduction. It became very well known as the value standard and what many others are compared against. It's a watch from what I consider to be the golden age of budget Seiko watches. This is the Seiko Sarb035. If you've been into watches for any amount of time, you probably already know all about this watch and the black-dialed 033. It is a watch that offered a lot for the money, and because of that, set a high standard for what $300 at the time could buy. It was a very complete package, and what many considered a budget one-watch collection. Were it to be released today, it would be part of the Presage collection, as it fits that dressy, everyday style. The Sarb, however, was first released in 2008, and was available for 10 years before it was discontinued. They were competitively priced under $500, and when I bought this one about 5 or 6 years ago, I paid about $300 from a grey market seller. That $300 got me a 6R15 hacking and hand-winding movement, a sapphire crystal, a solid stainless steel bracelet with solid end links and a milled clasp, and a classy, well-executed design that had many calling it a baby Grand Seiko. So, it's understandable why it became so popular. But unfortunately, as with many other watches, prices for this one shot up significantly after it was discontinued. These days, you'll see many sellers asking well over $1,000 and even multiple thousands for one of these new with stickers. Is even a cult classic like this Sarb worth that money though? Of course not. But for anyone like myself who was able to buy one before the price rises, it's a fantastic piece. So, let's take a look at it. In my opinion, if there's one thing that Seiko can do very well, it's an everyday watch that you can have on your wrist and suits almost any occasion. A lot of that comes down to the dial, and this 035 epitomizes that. It's simple, but not basic. There is a quote about design that I feel really sums it up. A designer knows he has achieved perfection, not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. This dial has everything you need and nothing you don't. Everything is well proportioned and balanced. Starting with the color, it is an off-white ivory dial that, while not drawing attention to itself, is more interesting than you might think when you look closely. The almost white color is understated but classy, perfect to wear every day and not look out of place. What initially looks like a flat, matte dial actually has a slight sunburst to it when the light hits it right, further adding visual interest. Above the pinion and under the 12 o'clock marker is an applied Seiko logo, and beneath the pinion we can see printed the word automatic in a cursive script and 21 joules underneath. That cursive script was a point of contention for some people, but I personally like it. It has more recently been used on some other Seiko watches too, so there must be enough fans out there. Around this, and marking the hours, are applied rectangular battens, with a mix of surface finishings and grooves that again, you won't notice unless you look closely. At 12 is a baton of double thickness, reminiscent of the Evolution 9 principles we heard about in my Grand Seiko video. A date complication at the 3 o'clock position is neatly framed and very useful on an everyday watch. Further adding to the everyday utility of the watch is the very inside of those battens being loomed for just a bit of after-dark legibility. Even further outside of these is a chapter ring the same color as the dial. This chapter ring has the most complexity and detail of the whole dial, but due to the fine line weight and crisp printing, does not overpower the rest of the dial. It has minutes as well as fifths of a minute marked, letting you read the time accurately. Moving back into the hands, we can see some familiar looking hands with slight differences. Like my Matcha Presage watch we looked at recently, this watch has Dauphine hands, with a bevel down the middle. Also just like the Presage, one side is brushed and the other polished to aid in legibility in various lighting conditions. Where it differs is that these are loomed in combination with those hour markers, and additionally, running right down that bevel in the middle is a black painted line. The second hand seems to be exactly the same as that on my Presage though, with a diamond counterbalance and needle tip. As mentioned, the crystal covering the dial and hands on the Sarb035 is sapphire. That is not something you would generally see on a Seiko watch costing $300 today. It is completely flat, and there is no kind of anti-reflective coating applied to reduce reflections. The crystal sits completely flush within the case, surrounded by a polished bezel. Moving on to that, let's take a look at the case. It is a very wearable 38mm, which will fit a range of wrists nicely. It is compact without looking small or dainty. That compactness is helped by the short lug-to-lug of 44.5mm and a height of just 11.2mm. This size also makes it comfortable to wear as an everyday watch, and it won't get in your way. Thankfully, the lug width of this watch is a standard 20mm, and that's very good, since both this and the Black Dial 033 look fantastic on lots of different straps. Looking at the case side on, we can see how the lugs curve downwards to hug the wrist. From here, we can also see an interesting feature of the case design. Like many other aspects, as we've heard, it's when you look closely at the case that you see it's more complex than it initially looks. Where the top transitions into the side of the case, there is a step that looks almost like another thin layer on top of the lugs. It's a subtle detail that you can easily miss. That top surface is brushed and the side polished. Also polished is the signed crown that does not screw down, but even so, together with the screw down caseback, gives the watch 100 meters of water resistance, yet another factor adding to their everyday usability. That caseback, as you can see, is a display caseback, giving you a look at the movement ticking away inside. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that movement is the 6R15, a step up from the standard 4R or NH movements you see. That movement has been superseded by the 6R35 with an increased power reserve and other improvements, but the 6R15 is still quite a decent movement. Attached to the case is a solid 3-link bracelet. The brushing on the bracelet is very smooth, and you can see the light gliding over it as you turn it. As it leaves the case, it tapers from that 20mm lug width to 18 by the time it reaches the clasp. The clasp is a source of complaints for many, and while not perfect, it is still perfectly adequate. It is thin and unobtrusive, which is what you would want on a watch like this, and even though the outer shell of the clasp is pressed, the scissor is milled and solid. The Seiko logo has been stamped into that outer shell. One complaint is the lack of micro-adjustment holes in the clasp. You've only got 2 spaces, which limits how precise a fit you can get. That, combined with the fact that there are no half links either, means that you will probably end up having it be a little tighter or a little looser than you'd like. Another complaint about this clasp is how much the edge of it sticks out, even when it's closed. Holding it like this, you can see a pretty big gap, and when it's on wrist, you'll see it even more. So, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. As you can see, the 38mm case suits my 7-inch wrist very well, and will also fit both larger and smaller ones too. The turn down of the lugs as they leave the case helps it to hug the wrist and sit very nicely. In proportion to the size of the case, the watch is a little bit thick, but it is still more than manageable. As I turn my wrist, you can see how the gap between the clasp and the bracelet is more pronounced when on wrist though. The cream-coloured dial looks great on a variety of other straps too. This brown leather really suits it and dresses it down a little. Dressing it up on leather is also pretty easy, like with this dark blue strap. If you really want to dress it down, it looks equally at home on this khaki NATO strap. The Black Dial 033 is probably a bit more versatile when it comes to straps, but this version still looks great on a wide range of them. Clearly, I like this watch. I've had a lot of good things to say about it and very little to complain about. The only complaints I've had relate to the bracelet not having half links, the clasp not having enough micro adjustment, and the gap between the clasp and the bracelet. These are, in my opinion, all pretty easy to look past when considering the overall package of the watch itself and the value it represented. Also, if you're not a bracelet person, then these aren't even issues at all. If you are, there are a few aftermarket options available as well to upgrade the bracelet. The only problem is that it's no longer available for reasonable prices. All in all, I feel that this watch definitely deserves the iconic status that it now enjoys in Seiko's back catalogue. It comes from a time when Seiko really offered great value at very accessible prices. With all of the recent pricing increases, I don't know if we'll ever see something like this from a non-micro brand ever again. What do you think about this watch? Do or did you have a Sarb in your collection? Do you think it's just an overhyped watch? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.